There are abandoned houses that look empty, and then there are the ones that feel like someone stepped out only moments ago. In the winter of 1912, on a silent stretch of rural Illinois, investigators found a farmhouse standing alone under a bruised sky, doors unlocked, lanterns burning low, and a full dinner still steaming on the table, as if the family had risen in the middle of a bite. But the chairs were overturned, footprints circled the house, and in the snow beyond the porch, there were drag marks, ending abruptly in a patch of untouched earth. What happened inside that house has never been fully explained. The discovery of the house began with something as mundane as a missing persons check, yet nothing about what Sheriff Delman saw that morning felt ordinary. The Harrow farmhouse sat at the end of a narrow dirt path that wound through skeletal trees, the kind that creaked even when there was no wind. Fresh snowfall covered the ground, untouched, except for the sheriff's own tracks. What struck him first was the silence, an unnatural heavy stillness, as if the entire property were holding its breath. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. The front door, a simple wooden panel with peeling green paint, stood slightly open, not forced, not splintered, just open, as if the family had stepped out only long enough to fetch something from the yard. Inside, warmth clung to the air despite the winter chill outside. The faint glow of lanterns still burning cast long, shaky shadows across the floorboards. Sheriff Delman paused in the doorway, unsure whether he was intruding or arriving too late. The scent of food, actual hot food, lingered in the air: stewed vegetables, cooked meat, fresh bread. On the table, 3 plates sat in a perfect triangle, each holding a meal that had clearly been eaten only partially. 1 fork was still upright in the stew, slowly sinking. Steam curled from the surface. The deputies exchanged glances, each silently asking the same question: how could a family who'd supposedly vanished hours ago leave behind a dinner that was still warm? The chairs were the next detail that disrupted the scene's strange normalcy. None of them were tucked in. Instead, they were pushed away from the table with such force that 2 were angled toward the hallway and 1 was toppled on its side. The sheriff crouched to examine it and noticed scratches on the floor where the legs had skidded. Something had startled them, something sudden enough to make all 3 rise at once. But the house was untouched, no signs of robbery, no struggle, no overturned furniture aside from the chairs. It looked like a family frozen mid-routine, interrupted by something unseen. The stove offered another layer of impossibility. The fire inside was still alive, glowing faintly, keeping the pot atop it warm. Sheriff Delman knew that the Harrows were reported missing the previous night. Even if they had left shortly after dinner, the fire should have died out hours ago. Kneeling closer, he held out his hand and felt heat. Not residual warmth, heat. Someone had tended to this fire far more recently than the missing family should have been home. In the living room, a quilt lay draped over the arm of a rocking chair, which continued to sway slightly as though it had been disturbed minutes before their arrival. The sheriff placed a hand on it to stop the movement, and the wood let out a low groan, settling into silence. Near the hearth, Mary Harrow's sewing basket sat open, a half-stitched sleeve hanging over the edge with the needle still threaded. Everything suggested a family who had intended to return within seconds. But then came the contradictions. Sheriff Delman checked the clock mounted above the fireplace, its hands frozen at 9:17 p.m. The air inside carried a faint chill that did not match the smell of warm food. And as the deputies moved deeper into the house, they found cold drifted in from places it shouldn't have. Through an upstairs hallway where every window was shut, through the gaps beneath doors that led to empty, undisturbed rooms. The deputies searched the house room by room, calling the Harrows names, expecting at any moment to find them huddled somewhere, injured or hiding. But the house resisted explanation. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen, but everything suggested interruption, as if the family had been pulled away in the middle of ordinary life. Outside, the sheriff noticed the strangest detail of all: no footprints leading away from the house, only the ones leading in, his own. Samuel and Mary Harrow had arrived in rural Illinois only half a year before their disappearance, settling into the old farmhouse with the kind of hopeful determination seen in families trying to start over. They came from a small town in Missouri where Samuel had worked as a machinist until an unexplained accident at the mill forced him into a long recovery. Rumors followed them from their old life, whispers of debts Samuel couldn't pay, of tensions with a former employer, of Mary's growing fear that their troubles were no longer just financial. The Harrows never addressed these stories openly, but neighbors sensed the couple had escaped something, even if they didn't speak of it. The land they purchased was cheap, too cheap for a property with fertile soil and a standing home, and townspeople quietly wondered why the price had been dropped so dramatically. Still, the Harrows took it, grateful for a place where they could raise their daughter Clara without the eyes of their old community judging them. Mary tried to integrate herself into the new town, visiting the general store, asking for advice about soil conditions, even offering to sew repairs for a few neighbors. Yet there was always something troubled behind her smile, as if she carried a question she was too afraid to ask out loud. Those who met her said she flinched at unexpected sounds, the clap of a wagon door, a dog barking, the creak of a porch board. She once admitted to the storekeeper's wife that the house felt too quiet, as if it waited for her to speak first before making any noise of its own. Samuel, for his part, worked tirelessly to restore the property. He mended the fence posts, repaired the barn roof, and spent long days plowing the land. But he avoided the eastern acreage for reasons he never explained. A neighbor named Elias Judd, who occasionally passed by on horseback, claimed he once saw Samuel standing motionless at the border of that field, staring at the tree line with a look of unease. Samuel later told Elias that the ground felt wrong underfoot, too soft in some places, too hollow in others. Their daughter Clara adapted the quickest. She was often seen running through the yard with a blue ribbon tied in her hair, laughing as she chased the chickens or fed the goats. But even she carried small signs of disturbance. One afternoon she ran to the road and waved down Elias, begging him to tell the tall man to stop looking in her window at night. When Elias questioned her, she described a figure with long arms and a hat with no top, but children often invent monsters, and he dismissed it gently. He never mentioned it to Samuel, though he later admitted that her description gave him an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. The Harrows' troubles began escalating just weeks before their disappearance. Mary confided in her sister through a series of letters that grew increasingly fragmented. In the earliest letters she described sleepless nights, unexplained noises on the roof, and the sensation that someone was walking around their house after midnight. Later letters grew more desperate. She wrote about muddy footprints appearing inside the kitchen each morning, prints much larger than Samuel's boots. She mentioned finding the barn door open, even though Samuel always bolted it. She said the animals grew restless at night, staring toward the eastern field, as if listening to something moving there. Samuel tried to reassure her, insisting the noises came from wildlife or shifting ice on the roof, but Mary seemed unconvinced. She wrote that Samuel himself had begun waking in the middle of the night, sweating and confused, insisting he heard someone whispering outside their bedroom window. He kept a lantern on his bedside table, even though oil was expensive, and he began checking on Clara 2 or 3 times each night. 3 days before the family vanished, Mary mailed her final letter. She never said they were planning to leave. Instead, she mentioned a single detail that no one in town could forget once investigators read it. She wrote that something had changed inside the house. She said the quiet no longer felt natural. It felt as though the house itself was waiting for something to arrive. Then at the bottom of the page, she added a line that chilled everyone who read it. "I think someone has already been inside, but Samuel doesn't believe me. I don't think we're alone when we sleep." Inside the Harrow farmhouse, the clues left behind defied every conventional explanation investigators tried to apply. The warm meal on the table was only the beginning, an unsettling hint that whatever had happened to the family had unfolded suddenly, in the middle of something as ordinary as dinner. Sheriff Delman leaned close to the plates, placing his hand a few inches above the surface. Heat radiated upward. Not lukewarm, not the faint lingering warmth of a meal cooked hours earlier, truly warm, as if someone had taken a bite moments before abandoning it. But according to the timeline, the Harrows had not been seen since the previous night. The idea that untouched food could retain warmth for so long was impossible unless someone had tended the fire or somehow been in the house long after the family vanished. Even more unnerving was the condition of the chairs. All three were pushed violently away from the table. The child's chair was nearly tipped backward, leaning against a table leg. A cup lay on the floor nearby, cracked but not shattered, as though dropped mid-movement. A single spoon had skidded to the edge of the table, almost ready to fall. Sheriff Delman studied the scratches on the floorboards, fresh, deep, and sharp. They indicated the chairs had been moved with force, not simply knocked over by accident. It looked like the entire family had risen in the same second, reacting to something sudden, something alarming enough to pull them away from the warmth of their dinner in one swift motion. The kitchen offered another layer of eerie detail. The stove fire still glowed with faint embers, producing steady heat. The pot of stew simmered gently, not vigorously, but enough to suggest it had been stirred or reopened sometime after the Harrows were believed to have disappeared. The iron handle of the pot was warm to the touch, too warm to have been untouched through the night. The sheriff checked the supply of firewood. Several pieces were stacked beside the stove, with sawdust scattered as though someone had cut fresh logs. But the axe remained outside, partially buried in snow, untouched since the previous afternoon. No fresh tracks led to or from the woodpile. Moving into the parlor, investigators found more signs that someone had been there very recently. A lantern sat atop a side table with a steady flame, neither full nor dying, but at the midpoint one might expect if lit within the last hour. A rocking chair was angled slightly toward the window, its runners faintly vibrating when the sheriff approached, as if it had been in motion seconds earlier. He steadied it with his hand and noticed warmth on the armrest, warmth that should not have lingered in a cold house overnight. Upstairs the clues turned darker. Clara's bedroom light was still burning. The quilt on her bed was thrown back abruptly, as if she had left in a hurry. A small toy horse lay overturned near her pillow, partly buried in snow blown through the window. The window itself was raised just an inch too small for a person to climb through, too wide to be caused by wind. Snow had accumulated on the floor in a thin arc, and in that arc were tiny footprints. Clara's prints based on the size, but they were facing the bed, not the window. They stopped abruptly halfway across the room. There were no prints after that. No retreat back toward the hallway, no leap or scramble, just a sudden end, a vanishing in the middle of the floor. In the master bedroom, Mary's sewing basket sat open with a spool of red thread unraveled across the floor. The last stitch she had made was crooked, as though her hand had been pulled or shaken while she worked. Near the window, the sheriff found a boot print, large, heavy, and unfamiliar. It didn't match Samuel's, whose boots were smaller and had distinct wear patterns. This print was deeper, pressed into the wooden boards as if made by someone with considerable weight, and yet no mud surrounded it. No trail led away. It was a single solitary impression in the center of the room, clean and sharply outlined. Downstairs the strangest clue waited near the back door, a handprint on the inside glass. It was smudged, elongated, with fingers longer than any adult's should be. The sheriff measured it with his own hand and found it stretched almost an inch beyond his fingertips. The smudge was fresh, oily, warm to the touch. Whoever had left it behind had touched that glass recently. The investigators left that room in silence, each of them feeling an unspoken truth settle in their bones. The Harrows hadn't simply walked out of their home. Someone or something had been inside with them, and whatever had driven them from the dinner table had never truly left the house. Neighbors later filled in the pieces of the night the Harrow family vanished, though none of their stories aligned perfectly, and that was what made them so disturbing. The closest neighbors lived nearly a mile away, yet each claimed they heard or saw something from the direction of the Harrow farmhouse that didn't match any natural explanation. The first to speak up was Elias Judd, the same man Clara had once asked for help. That night he had been tending to his horses when he heard what he described as a single sharp scream rising from the fields, high-pitched at first, then dropping into a guttural echo that didn't sound like any human voice he had ever heard. The scream lasted only a moment before it cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The horses reacted violently, bucking in their stalls, ears pinned back, eyes wide as if something had moved past the barn. Elias later admitted he stayed inside until morning, too unsettled to investigate in the dark. Another neighbor, Alma Reed, reported seeing a strange light hovering above the Harrow property around the same time. From her attic window she noticed an amber glow flickering just beyond the tree line, shifting and pulsing like firelight but never rising or falling the way flames should. She described it as a lantern being swung slowly back and forth by someone too tall to be standing on flat ground. The glow lasted several minutes before drifting sideways across the field too smoothly, Alma insisted, to have been carried by any person. She watched it move as though it had a path of its own, weaving between the trees, then disappearing completely. She didn't sleep at all that night, and when she heard the scream hours later, the connection felt unmistakable. But she didn't tell anyone until days after the sheriff's visit. She later confessed she feared people would think she'd gone mad. A third witness, an older farmer named Yates Hollinger, claimed he saw movement along the ridge behind the Harrow farm just after dusk. He was returning from checking his traps when he noticed a line of figures standing in the snow, 3 small shapes and one much taller, all facing the farmhouse. He assumed it was the Harrows accompanied by a visitor, though he found it strange they stood so still in the cold. He called out to them from a distance, but none responded. When he approached closer, the figures vanished behind the ridge. The next morning he swore he saw only 3 sets of footprints leading toward the house, none leading away. The tall figure, he insisted, left no prints at all. What unsettled investigators most were the stories shared by the children in the area. Several claimed they had woken in the middle of the night to tapping sounds on their windows, slow, deliberate taps, as if someone were moving from one window to the next. One boy said he saw a shadow move past his curtain, longer than the wall and shaped like it was bending or leaning. Another insisted he saw a face staring in, pale, hollow-eyed, and stretched wider than any normal human face. Parents dismissed these accounts at first, but when the Harrow disappearance became public, the stories resurfaced with new urgency. More witnesses came forward with smaller details: a dog that refused to cross the property line, whimpering and pulling against its leash; a pair of hunters who heard whispers traveling across the field like wind carrying words; a traveling salesman who saw what he described as a column of smoke rising from the ground itself near the Harrow well. Each testimony added another strange layer to a night that was already difficult to explain. None of the neighbors heard the Harrows themselves. No shouts for help, no arguments, no frantic footsteps. It was as if the family had been swallowed by a silence too thick for sound to escape. Whatever descended on the Harrow property that night moved quietly, deliberately, without leaving room for human response. And the witnesses who saw its light, its shadow or its shape, were left with an impression they could never quite articulate. Something had come to the Harrow farm, but it hadn't arrived like a visitor. It had materialized as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Long before the Harrows ever set foot on that isolated patch of Illinois soil, the land carried a reputation nobody discussed openly, but everyone silently respected. It began with small stories, whispers among farmers, rumors shared over fence posts, warnings given to children but never explained. The property had changed hands too many times for such a fertile stretch, and each owner left sooner than expected. Each departure shrouded in the same vague explanation: it wasn't a good fit, or the land wasn't right. The truth was less polite. People felt uneasy there. Animals refused to graze in certain spots. Tools rusted faster. And on some nights, lights were seen shifting along the eastern field, as though reflected off something that wasn't there. The earliest recorded incident dated back to 1861, when the land belonged to a widower named Luther Brandt. He lived alone, tending a modest farm while grieving the loss of his wife. He was known to be quiet, even withdrawn, but in the winter of that year his behavior changed dramatically. He began visiting town more frequently, talking in hurried, paranoid tones about something walking the fields. When pressed, he said it waited until after moonrise, and that he often heard it circling his house, tapping on the windows with a patience no animal would have. The townspeople dismissed him as lonely and grief-stricken, until he was found dead at the bottom of his well. No signs of foul play were established, but the sheriff at the time wrote in his notes that the lid of the well had been closed neatly over him. Luther couldn't have closed it from the inside. Suspicion deepened in 1898 when two farmhands working the property disappeared without explanation. They were young men hired during harvest season, both known for drinking and brawling, so at first townspeople assumed they had simply run off. But their belongings, including wages owed to them, were still in their cabin. Their tools lay in the field where they'd been working, neatly arranged, as if they had stepped away for just a moment. Tracks in the dirt showed the two men walking toward the eastern field. But there were no return prints, no branching paths, just a straight line of footfalls that simply stopped. The owner at the time, a man named Callum Bishop, abandoned the farm a week later. He refused to speak of what he saw that night, though he was overheard telling a friend, "It doesn't matter what took them. It didn't walk in. It came up from underneath." Other incidents were less documented but equally haunting. A family in the early 1900s reported hearing low rhythmic thumping beneath their floorboards at night. They lasted 3 months before leaving. A traveling preacher who camped near the eastern field in 1905 reported seeing a figure without a form, a shadow that stretched across the ground without a body to cast it. He left before sunrise. Neighbors long believed that something was wrong with the ground itself. There were tales of soft pockets in the soil that seemed to breathe when stepped upon, of animals avoiding the field entirely, of a hollow sound when striking the earth with a shovel. Some said the trees on the property grew at odd angles, bending as though leaning away from something unseen. A few believed the land had been cursed long before any farmhouse stood there, possibly tied to older settlements or unmarked graves. But those were guesses, superstitions spoken quietly, never recorded. What troubled investigators most after the Harrows vanished was how their experiences mirrored those of past owners. The muddy footprints Mary described in her letters matched the unexplained prints found in an 1870 incident involving a school teacher who lived on the property. The tapping on windows echoed Luther Brandt's claims. Even Clara's fear of a tall man with a hat that had no top echoed descriptions from the 1905 preacher who insisted he saw a shadow bending unnaturally in the moonlight. The land had a pattern. People arrived with hope, sensed something they couldn't name, and left abruptly when they managed to leave at all. The Harrows had not been the first family to vanish from that acreage. They were simply the first whose evidence remained intact long enough to be studied. And as investigators pieced together the testimonies and the stories carved into the property's past, it became clear that something had been there long before the Harrows, and that it did not intend to leave. Detectives arrived next morning under a pale, trembling sky. The ground had frozen overnight, but inside the farmhouse, the warmth lingered, a detail no investigator could ignore. They moved with measured steps, boots creaking on the boards as they surveyed each room. In the kitchen, they took note of the dinner dishes still warm, the chair still tipped, the pot's handle still hot. One deputy cautiously withdrew a fork from the stew, its prongs sticky with gravy, as though dinner had been abandoned mid-bite. He gingerly set it on a cloth. The cloth absorbed no moisture, nothing dripped, no spills. That absence of disorder shocked them almost more than the presence of warm food. It suggested precision, a sudden departure, one organized enough to avoid knocking over plates, yet chaotic enough to leave the stove lit. That contradiction echoed in every other clue they found. They sketched the floor and measured the angles of the fallen chairs, filmed the stove's embers, took lantern light photographs. In the parlor, they found a rocking chair slightly angled toward the window, its wood still warm when touched. its previous motion leaving faint tracks on the rug. Upstairs, the child's bedroom held the oddest detail, the tiny footprints in the snow-dusted floor ending dead center of the room. They measured them, matched them with the clothes Clara wore. The soles were too slender, too perfectly defined. That frozen lead stopped at the quilt's edge. They searched under the bed, inside the closet, behind the curtains. Nothing. No sign of struggle. No shreds of clothing. No trace of the girl at all. In Mary's sewing corner, the red thread lay tangled on the floor, its spool upended. An irregular stitch remained on the unfinished hem of Clara's winter coat. Only one. The investigators speculated that Mary had tried to secure the coat in haste, perhaps after Clara ran off toward the door. But windows showed no scuff marks, no cracks. The latch of the back door, when tested, was intact. The lock had not been engaged. The door opened inward. Outside, snow blanketed the yard, fresh, pristine, except for a set of footprints leading toward the house, none leading away. Even the muddy prints Mary had warned about in her letters were absent, replaced by nothing but fresh, clean snow. Someone had come into the house that night, but nothing indicated they left. When they turned to forensic detail of the era, they found more contradictions. The fire in the stove was still generating moderate heat. A piece of firewood had been split recently. Sawdust scattered next to the unused axe outside. A deputy found a fresh-cut scrap beneath the handle. That meant someone chopped wood inside. But the logs stacked had melted, patches of snow seeping through the cracks, meaning heat had radiated through them. Yet outside, no footprints trailed from the woodpile. Whoever chopped wood had done so under cover of darkness or invisibility. The lantern light in the stair hall was still lit, the flame steady, gasping slightly as though someone had just adjusted it. The sheriff ordered a search of the surrounding woods and fields, but found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no abandoned tracks, no shed or overturned sled, no sign that people or animals had moved off the property. The well at the back of the house, an old stone structure sealed with a wooden lid, was securely closed. No sap marks on the wood, no fresh soil disturbance around the rim. Even with a full search party, no hint of where the family, or whoever might have taken them, could have gone. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. Local dogs were brought in, sniffing through the fields and house, but each balked at the threshold. Those puppies trembled. Some even whimpered as though sensing something unseen. One dog, almost feral, stood at the back door staring at the stove, growling low before refusing to enter further. That reaction was recorded as odd, irrational, but for the men of the town, who had buried countless griefs and losses in these quiet plains, that hesitation carried meaning. Medical examiners found nothing in the dining room or bedrooms to suggest poisoning. No overturned cups, no spilled wine, no signs of sickness. Nothing out of place except for the presence or absence of the people themselves. Their beds lay untouched, clothes folded neatly in closets, shelves dusted. There was no blood, no fight, no forced entry. The only fingerprint recovered was on the kitchen glass door, an elongated smudge that did not match any of the three family members, nor any deputy. The print was oily, too large, with fingers uncommonly long. They cast plaster for the impression. The ridge details were faint, smudged as if the fingers were wet or gloved in something heavy. But no prints followed, no trail from door to road, no sign of tracks in the snow, no drag marks beyond the single set investigators had documented. In the weeks that followed, they combed the town, checked trains, wagons, neighboring farms. No one reported seeing a family matching the Harrow's description leaving the area. No record of transactions for food, no inquiries at the station, no bills in local shops. Their barn animals remained, the goats in the pen, the hens in the coop, fenced, fed, but starved of their keepers. The horses that neighbors had heard spooked that night were quiet again. One by one, every normal explanation unraveled. Accident, elopement, robbery, murder. None fit this pattern. What remained was a ledger filled with unanswerable questions. If you've stayed with this story until now, then you already feel the weight of what happened inside that house, the warmth of a dinner that should have gone cold, the clues that contradicted each other, the lives that seemed to vanish between one breath and the next. Stories like this aren't just mysteries, they're reminders of how fragile a moment can be, how quickly the ordinary can fracture into something unexplainable. And if you found yourself replaying details, questioning what was real and what was left behind on purpose, then this is the place for you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next descent into the forgotten corners of history, where every unanswered question opens the door to another. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what detail struck you the most? Which clue changed your understanding of the Harper's final night? Your voice shapes these investigations, your theories breathe life into these lost stories. And somewhere out there, another abandoned place waits with its own unsettling truth. Stay curious, and stay with us.